You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. We're glad to have you along. Taking you back, a few months now to the passage of that massive tax legislation called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. There was an offshoot of that which caused quite a stir in agricultural circles. It had to do with how certain provisions were to be considered when it comes to doing business with cooperatives, and we'll explain that all, but it falls under the heading of the Section 199A issue. Along with this, Brian Briggeman, the director of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center here at Kansas State University. And he and a colleague out of Oklahoma State University have just come out with a new analysis of the revision on Section 199A, what it means to you grain producers. Run us back through the storyline on Section 199A, if you would, Brian, how it originated and what the hang-up was.
Right. So back in December, kind of when the final legislation was being worked out on the bill for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, there was discussion of removing Section 199, or the Domestic Production Activities Deduction, because they were lowering the corporate tax rate. But through different efforts in Washington, D.C., a new Section 199A was put into place. Basically, with the thought behind it was, let's replace what we were losing in 199, because it was a tremendous benefit to cooperatives and producers from not just in Kansas, but across the United States. So the 199A, as it was in December, was put into place. But after it was released and tax experts and academics, including myself and others, looked at it, it was pretty clear that there might be a shift in grain movement within the state, because there was a pretty strong incentive to sell to a cooperative. As you can imagine, that caused a bit of an uproar. I know my phone was ringing off the hook, and you and I did an interview on it, and I wrote a fact sheet along with Phil Kinkle at Oklahoma State just talking about it. We did a webinar. Since that time, in March, there was a revision that was passed through both houses, signed by the president. And part of that was the fix to 199A. So that's where we're at currently. Mm-hmm. And basically, they're trying to get back to a very similar wording and language as it was in the Domestic Production Activities Deduction, what all cooperatives and grain producers were operating under in 2017. However, there are some nuances. There's still some differences in it. And that was the point of this fact sheet, was for Phil and I to sit down and say, okay, for cooperative board of directors, for grain producers who are thinking about marketing their grain, what does this all mean? Mm-hmm. Long story short, the big thing to take away is go talk to your tax advisor, because there's a lot to it. There's a lot of things to kind of think about and digest within this revision.
It's imperative to have that conversation. The fix for Section 199A, we want to give a broad brush idea of what all of this means. For one thing, cooperative boards, those that are making decisions on all of this, including disbursement and so forth, are having to go through some decision making that will influence what goes on here, you say?
Yes, cooperatives will still have some Section 199A deduction that they can claim. You know, the deduction, it's tied to their qualified production income, 9% of that. But that deduction is limited by 50% of the cooperative's W-2 wages in that particular department, which largely in most co-ops, as we think about in Kansas, is in the grain side. So we would see that being as the limiting factor on the deduction. Now, cooperatives can keep some at the cooperative level, or they can pass a portion of that or all of it through to their patrons. And I know many cooperative boards are out there right now looking and working with their auditing firms and tax experts to say, okay, well, what is that balance? How much should we keep at the cooperative level? How much should we pass through? Now, if we look at 199A at the producer level, this is where it's important for why a lot of cooperative boards, at least the ones that I talk to, really are thinking about, well, we need to pass through some of this 199A deduction, because this fix that was done in March made it more complicated at the producer level. And here's why. The first thing to note on the producer level is that if you are a C corporation farmer, you do not qualify for the 199A deduction. The reasoning behind it is that under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, all corporations received a 40% drop in their tax rate, going from the very top end, 35% down to 21%. Now, not all farmers were paying that 35% rate, and that's another discussion that we can have. But I think the big thing is why C corporations do not qualify for this is because of that 21% corporate tax rate.
They're perceived to have received their relief.
Right, to receive the relief. So through those other pass-through entities, the non-corporate, so S corporation, partnership, LLC, sole proprietorship, they immediately get a 20% deduction for 199A. So you automatically have that. Now, if you sell to a cooperative, that's when some of the marketing becomes a little different because a cooperative is a pass-through entity itself, right? It is owned by those farmer patrons out there, and cooperative boards have the ability to pass through. There's another deduction that is looked at as far as a limitation goes. So for the qualified business income that the farmer, the patron has with the cooperative, 9% of that qualifies for any additional amount that can go and be passed through to a cooperative. So we could potentially see that 20% go higher. Depends on a lot of factors, but bottom line is that 20% could go up. Now, where those farmers would see a benefit of going up are those farmers that do not pay any W-2 wages. So if you're a producer, grain producer out there, and you do not have any W-2 wages, and if you sell to a cooperative, not only would you get the cash patronage that is distributed if the board decides to do that at the end of the year, but you would also get any additional amount of pass-through on 199A. So it could be a very potentially good thing, right, that you could see an additional deduction go up above that 20% mark. Where it gets, questioning about is those, well, what if you do pay W-2 wages? At what point does that become limiting? And that's when you get into those higher wages. If you pay a significant amount of W-2 wages, then all of a sudden that's no longer zero, right? Your 20% doesn't go down. It could actually be lower than that. And then it would be contingent upon the cooperative passing through some of their 199A deduction to the farmer to bring them back to 20%. Like I said, that's about as high level as I can go. I mean, over the radio, because you really need to read the fact sheet to kind of fully understand all of it. But I think it's important to note that 20% deduction for non-corporate farmers. If you pay no wages, right, there's a potential for some additional coming back to you by selling to a co-op. But if you're a high wage paying farmer, that's when it kind of comes into a question of, well, how much will the co-op pass through to me? So, it's definitely something that's being discussed at great lengths within cooperative boardrooms as well as grain producers, just trying to figure out what's the best way to maximize this 199A deduction, take full benefit of it.
It is complicated. And in conclusion, in your write-up, though, you note that when you boil it all down and look at it broadly, the difference between delivering grain to a cooperative versus an independent recipient warehouse, that might be relatively small across the board.
Right. I really don't think there's going to be a huge change with marketing practices. And also, too, I think the way at least a lot of Kansas cooperatives handled the 199 deduction in the past, many cooperatives out there passed it through, or passed a significant portion through to their patrons. And so I can't predict exactly what every cooperative is going to do, but if the past and history is any indication of the future, I think that the way this is built up, especially for those high wage paying farmers, there's a strong incentive for the cooperative to pass it through because they want to make sure, that 20% deduction remains. So that's, I think, where it boils down to, do we think there's going to be just this huge, big shift in grain movement? No, I don't anticipate that. at all for this coming marketing year. But it'll be something that we'll have to watch and monitor as it goes through. And certainly cooperatives and grain producers need to keep an eye on it as well.
And we'll underscore this, which you brought up at the outset. If they want to know where they stand within all of this as a grain producer or otherwise as a patron of a cooperative, they need to be working through this with their tax advisor.
Absolutely. Sit down and consult your tax advisor to figure out what's best for your operation, because every single operation is different.
And do take the time to look at this article, which captures this in much more detail, and the devil is, in fact, in the details on this one. This is posted on the agmanager.info website. It's entitled, Impact of Revised Section 199A on Grain Producers. It was put together by Brian and his colleague Phil Kenkel of Oklahoma State University. Good read at agmanager.info. Brian, thanks for coming over.
Thanks, Eric.
He's the director of the Arthur Capper Cooperative Center at Kansas State University, agricultural economist Brian Briggeman. We'll be back with more after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
This is Agriculture Today. Last Thursday, we talked with K-State's Ignacio Ciampitti about soybean planting dates and the volume of K-State research that's been collected on that very topic at numerous locations around the state the past several years. Of course, there is more to seeding than just the planting dates, namely soybean seeding rates and row spacing as other variables to consider, and Ignacio is going to pick up on those with us today. He's a crop production specialist with K-State Research and Extension, as you know. So seeding rates, and what should one focus on there when they're determining what rate is appropriate for a given field, Ignacio?
Well, Eric, again, thanks for an opportunity to discuss this topic. I think that in terms of the seeding rates, one of our key factors that we tend to emphasize in many situations is about the productivity level. We want to emphasize to our farmers that we might have a chance to do some variable rate, soybean seeding rates, but the way to look at those variable rates, soybean seeding rates, is basically by focusing more on what will be my yield target, what will be my yield potential for the site that I'm planning to plant. And the other thing is that also that many times we don't talk much about this. Is like we always have in our mind an optimal number of plants that we want to see. Mm-hmm. But there is a kind of a difference between the final number of plants and the optimal seeding rate, okay? And the difference is that in many situations, when we discuss about seeding rates on soybeans, in this case, we are always thinking, okay, I might have on average 80% of germination and emergence, which means that I'm assuming that from the seeding rate that I'm recommending, I don't get 20% of all the seeds, and then I might be able to get only 80% of final stand for soybeans. Some research that we put together from the last couple years, I mean, we have around more than 20 on-farm research studies, have some seeding rate studies, and we basically count the number of plants. And in many situations, we are seeing more and more variability coming from yield environments. In a very good high-yielding environment, let's say that 70, 80 bushel soybean yields, in those environments, we tend to see that there is a close match between our seeding rate and final number of plants. And probably we have only like saying 5 to 10%, no more than that. When you go to a yield environment of 50 bushels, then we start seeing more 10s or 15% of seeds that they were not properly germinating or they are not emerging, so they didn't become effective plants. And when we go to low, poor environments, in some situations we are seeing even more than that. We are seeing that maybe 20% or 25% of those plants were not coming up. from those seeds.
So yield potential and that given field is dictating the likelihood of greater or lesser emergence and whether or not it's a severe drop-off or not, right?
Yeah, and the yield potential, in fact, in some way is basically reflecting a problem. And then we can go back and start discussing very briefly some of these issues, but a low yield potential might be it could be related to a constraint in the soil, related to a pH problem, related to a nutrient deficiency, related to a low spot in the field that tends to be always flooded. So these low yielding environments are factors that they will be limiting yield, and in many situations, some of the limitations are coming early season. Mm-hmm. Even if I say that in a low yielding environment, my optimal number of seeds is maybe 75 or 80,000 seeds. When I think about seeding rate, I need to start thinking about adding a coefficient that will be basically affecting that number by a plus 25%.
Mm-hmm. So maybe 100,000 seeds or
exactly.
In that ballpark.
And it looks like in many situations, your optimal seeding rate in some situations, for the low yielding environments, is to be a little bit higher. Just because in many situations we are seeing a tendency of a problem in low yielding environments to establish those plants. When you start moving to high yielding environments, and we did that exercise on the article. On the article we start looking at what is the optimal population per yield environment. But again, that optimal population is not a seeding rate. And the optimal population usually follows what is typical for any crop. As you go from a very low yielding environment, you are trying to target 75,000 plants. When I'm going less than 30 bushels, I'm trying to go back up there now from 30 to 40, and then I'm just racing up, and I'm trying to target for that around 75, 80,000 plants, okay, final plants. And you can continue as we move forward, like 40 to 50 bushels. I would like to have at least 110 and 120,000 plants. And then if you really are looking at a high-yielding environment, sometimes even with the same number, you will be fine. So there is one point that after maybe 40 bushels, 40, 50 bushels, that our final number of plants doesn't need to change too much because the emergence and the effectiveness of establishing those seeds into plants is really high. And pushing for high yields is not connected in those cases for with seeding rates.
So this is a place where a producer, if they have those higher yielding potentials, can economize on their seeding rates, maybe save a little.
Yeah, I could say some of that and make sure that you look at the low yielding environments, because in many situations, if you go way too low there, you will not be able to establish a good canopy, and then by the end of the season, you might be losing more in the low yielding environments than in the high ones. So our main emphasis is to show that in many situations, this number that we use as an 80% always ballpark on emergence and germination rate, and is usually not as constant as we believed. And then the other thing is also we were able to capture some data from Kansas soybeans. Every year they do a yield contest. And in the yield contest, what they do is, in many situations, they are capturing data and farmers are sharing data related to management practices and how they were able to achieve those high yields. If you look at the data from those farmers, you will find that in order to achieve between 80 to 90 bushels and above on those levels of really high yields, it looks like the maximums, yields are connected to final seeding rates of 120,000. But when you move from 120,000 to 180, it looks like kind of a flat.
So there's the plateau.
There is a plateau that we found also on the research side. This is basically not only on the research side, but also information that is self-reported by farmers. I think the key messages from that information is this. When we go below 120 for maximum yields, it looks like we are being penalized in those soybeans because, we are not having sufficient canopy to maximize yields. When we go beyond 180,000, basically what we're doing is we're increasing way too much that canopy, and the problem is not intercepting light, having more plants, but basically you are running out of water.
Mm-hmm. So there's your comfort zone, if you will.
Exactly. And the second topic is on the row spacing. Most of the times when I discuss row spacing data, I emphasize the importance of the row spacing in really helping us to become much better at controlling weeds.
Right.
By doing narrows, versus a wide rows. In terms of an input saving, what would be the cost by looking at a 15-inch versus a 30-inch?
So the question is, can you plant in narrower rows and save on herbicide costs, which will compensate for the additional cost of that tighter row, if you will?
And the answer in many situations, I think that will be saying yes, because theoretically, and we are seeing exactly this in many of our on-farm research with farmers, is like these narrow rows. What they do is that they're helping us to close the canopy faster. On those 15 inches, basically there is no space, solid soybeans, no space for any wheat basically to grow. And again, it's not so much about basically saying I'm more effective in intercepting light and hopefully I will get more yield. How can I increase early season competition of my plants to make sure that those plants can outcompete the weeds?
Early in the season.
Early in the season, exactly. We try to summarize data from multiple locations. In the last 4 or 5 years, we did at least 15 studies on narrow rows, with farmers in collaboration, large strips, all over the board. Sometimes we have small benefits, sometimes we have slightly negative benefits, like maybe minus 1 bushel, but in many situations we tend to have some positive benefits at the end, even on yields.
So even though we're heading into a season that may be a dry stretch for our soybeans, you would nonetheless suggest producers at least consider narrow row beans, 15-inch rows.
Yeah, and again, if we are going into a very dry situation, sometimes what we can place, and that's why we discussed at the beginning of this topic, is on the seeding rates. Mm-hmm. So you could still play with narrowing rows and put your seeding rate slightly down if you are concerned about basically water consumption early in the season. But imagine that most of the soybeans, compared with corn, these soybeans will be at the peak of water consumption, usually around mid-August. So I think that we are quite safe in many situations, in many environments, by just narrowing rows and make sure that we are doing a much better weed control.
Producers, once again, Ignacio has authored an article on this aspect of soybean planting, that is, rate selection, row spacing. You can find that article in the recent Agronomy e-Update newsletter dated April the 20th at agronomy.ksu.edu. Good input as always. Ignacio, thanks once again.
Thanks, Eric, for the invitation.
He is crop production specialist Ignacio Ciampitti of K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today will be back in a few moments with more here on the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today returns now, and it's our weekly segment on wildlife for you from Charlie Lee, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Charlie, this segment is for those who appreciate the presence of hummingbirds in their backyards, other settings, and they are now making their return for their annual visit.
Yes, hummingbirds are very popular among ornithologists, among amateur naturalists, homeowners that eagerly anticipate their return each year. They have some very unique morphological characteristics and behavioral characteristics that make them a species that most people really appreciate. Oftentimes, folks want them to stay around as long as possible, and the first thing they think of is, well, what can I feed them? And fortunately, hummingbirds are very well adapted to the use of artificial feeders, and consequently, we have literally hundreds of thousands of people that use artificial feeders for hummingbirds each and every year.
And they will show up just about now, and this is the normal migration period for them?
This would be the normal migration through Kansas. Of course, you always have some outliers that will come through a little bit earlier. I don't think we're quite at the peak yet, but from what I hear, they're just starting to show up this past week. at least here about the I-70 location through Kansas. They're a species that's eagerly anticipated by numerous people, and it's quite often that then they start social media telling them which one got the first hummingbirds in the neighborhood.
The idea here on the part of folks is to encourage them to stay around as long as possible by artificial feeding, and there are all sorts of feeder types out there, aren't there?
Yeah, a very common one is the bottle hummingbird feeders. There's just a large bottle that contains the nectar, which runs into a base, and then there's a number of feeding ports around that base. Those have a large capacity, so they don't need to be refilled as regularly. And some think that large size makes them more visible to hummingbirds that are just passing through. I find them to be a little bit more difficult to clean than some of the basin-style feeders, which are those that are shaped somewhat like a flying saucer or a very shallow pan. The nectar then sets in that basin and has the feeding ports on the top. Those are easy to clean. They also typically have built-in bee guards, but since they have a smaller capacity, they need to be filled more frequently than the bottle-type feeders. Hummingbirds are territorial, and they chase others away from their feeder, so you're likely to attract more hummingbirds to your yard if you place several smaller feeders in your yard rather than one large single feeder and expect all of them to feed out of one.
And the standard nectar provided, the mixes, those are pretty even across the board, are they?
Well, you can certainly purchase a pre-made nectar. Just have to add water, but many people make their own by mixing together water and white sugar at a ratio of 4 parts of water to 1 part of white sugar. You want to make sure that you're not using honey or any food dye or brown sugar in your hummingbird nectar, and then make sure that sugar is completely dissolved in the water.
Some folks have brought up this question. It's actually been addressed through research. If one is artificially feeding hummingbirds, does that change in any way their normal plant, in this case flower, pollination?
This has been the subject of research several different times, and unfortunately it's somewhat with controversial results. Some have showed that nectar feeders decreased visitation to nearby plants and reduced the seed set in one particular plant species in Mexico. Another study showed that about 50% of all of the hummingbirds that were examined carried 0 or no pollen loads in the close proximity to feeders. And then a third study showed that the feeders locally increased flower visitation, and thus presumably they would increase the pollination of the surrounding plants. So there was an additional study that was done in Brazil to look at some of those factors, and the results were similar to the third study that I just mentioned. Their findings illustrated that the artificial nectar feeders may locally increase hummingbird abundance, particularly within 125 meters of that feeder, which could possibly affect the species composition of hummingbirds that come to those locations, and could affect species composition and pollination of the flowers as a result of the hummingbird presence. But they really did not have a disruptive effect on the pollination or the plant's reproductive fitness. So I guess at that, the study would say that, yes, you can increase the number of hummingbirds in an area with the presence of feeders, at least within the immediate area around the feeder, but it's probably not going to have a significant effect on the pollination of those flowers nearby.
So some reassurance there if anybody's worried about that. And as a last thought here, one can complement the artificial feeding that they're providing to hummingbirds by making sure they've got the attractive flowers out there in their beds and borders that will further encourage them to stick around.
Now, there are certainly some hummingbird-friendly flowers, trees, and shrubs. Hollyhocks, begonias, azaleas are just a few of those that are particularly important for hummingbirds. and then avoid using pesticides in your garden. Those would be some very easy things to accomplish to attract hummingbirds besides the addition of artificial feeders.
The return of hummingbirds in Kansas is underway, and those are some thoughts on, once more, encouraging them to be part of your overall home landscape setting. Charlie, appreciate the word on this. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee there. And that wraps up today's edition. Remember, once again, to listen to the podcast version of our broadcast, go to agtoday.net, or using your podcast app on your mobile device, type these keywords in Agriculture Today, Kansas for the search, and you'll find the program. Just tap on the subscribe button there, and brand new episodes of this program will automatically arrive on your device every weekday. But we also hope that you'll continue to join us right here on this affiliate every single weekday morning, including tomorrow, where again we'll have our update from the Kansas Wheat Tour, as K-State's Romulo Lolato will check in with us, and more, so be with us again then, won't you? Meantime, Eric Atkinson here, bidding you a good day for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.